I would like to ask Lina Reinsbakken on the stage. She will tell us something a bit magical, as I just learned. So we're talking fairy tales in VR, and I'm really excited for this because I always had this feeling when I see people using VR, especially adults, that they get back this like sense of childlike wonder. There's something that they go into this other world, and they are suddenly like allowed to have that kind of magic again and feel that and have that excitement. So this typical VR phase is like it has something very childlike. So I'm really curious how you guys are dealing with that and exploring this field of like a more fairy tale like VR experience. So your background is in photography and painting, right? All right, cool. Then let's hook you up with the microphone and wait no longer. And give it up for Lina.
Hi. Okay. I'm just going to tell you a story. Okay, so once upon a time, in a kingdom not so far away, there lived a girl who grew up believing in fairy tales. Under the mythical allure of the northern lights and the beauty of the midnight sun, her world was engulfed with the magic of imagination. She was gifted with fantasy creativity and a grandfather who gave her a sense of wonder. In a house by the sea, where the sun is set in the ocean, her grandfather painted the walls with magic. He would tell her fairy tales and stories about the mythical creatures of the Nordic folklore and the old Nordic gods of Norse mythology. Were the wonderful adventures that made her mind travel into other worlds and made her dreams feel real. The dreams of creatures that dwelled in the forest, and in the mountains and under the sea. Together they would make up new tales and memories by drawing, painting, and playing with her grandfather's violin. These were the things that made her heart sing. So the little girl was mesmerized by the stories from the Norse myths and Nordic folklore, especially the adventures that were mystical, dark, and scary, as a Norwegian. Because she was inspired by the elusive, because they would inspire the elusive and tantalizing forces of fantasy. They would transport her consciousness to a realm where dreaming and awakened state would meet, and her vivid imagination would bring the characters and places to life. She became amongst them and part of their story. She longed to capture this moment of magic and the moment when you are transcended and can feel the divine, the electromagnetic field of the universal consciousness, or the embrace of Freya that enlightens your mind and makes your heart sing. Sadly, her grandfather died while she was really young, but these early memories of sense of wonder he had given her was permanently etched into her soul and would ultimately shape her future. As she grew older, she would always create. She would keep the wonder alive by drawing, painting, sculpting, and any other forms she could create with. It was like a force from within, an endless itch to be scratched. She was art, and art was her. And everywhere she went, this itch went with her. She would try and control and dominate these creative and uncontrollable impulses that were internalized. And whenever a great wave of inspiration would run through her, she would try her best to catch it. Or she would see it disappear before, like if it was a scared creature or an animal. She would call this creature Freya. No, sorry, Fylgja, a follower. And it's after the Norse mythology notion that everyone has a follower attached to them. It's your own personal fate weaver, or norn as they're called. And it's the creature that spins your thread of destiny. So being adventurous, she embarked on a journey to find her place in life and to try to conquer the world. She went far and wide, crossed borders, oceans, and she crossed a few lines. She needed to reignite the sense of wonder again, try to create the moment of transcendence, that elusive and tantalizing divine will in motion. She searched long and far. She was adventurous and fearless. She floated along rivers and let the wind carry her, looking for a place in the world. And she thought she'd found it at the top of the world, the dream place, the dream job, and a platform to shine. But like in Norse mythology, the fylgja is often referred to as in the land of draumir, and that is the state of sleep, and not in control of your thread that it's spinning. And she didn't realize that her fylgja had fallen asleep and something or someone else was spinning. She had stopped listening to the song in her heart, and without realizing it, the song slowly died. Her song had stopped singing, and her sense of wonder was locked up and internalized. She was left fighting battles of stress, internalized torture, and living a meaningless life, she felt. She realized that she had not followed her dream, but she had been seduced by the pointless pursuit of excellence. And in the process, she had lost her sense of wonder. So the concrete jungle they called the Big Apple became a gray and dark with the absence of meaning, and the magic was gone. But then something happened, an unexpected turn of event, something so big that her thinking would change, and ultimately it would change her path forever. So I can't really tell you how the story ends because I don't know it yet. But I can tell you what the turning point of the story is, and that is 10 years ago, my niece was born with 6 air bubbles in her brain. She's struggled with death many times through the first weeks, and then they put her in an induced coma to let the swelling in her brain go down. And this was so devastating for the whole family. It was like earth-shattering moments, and it makes you really think about what life is about and what you're doing. So yes, I started thinking about my own life and question what I was doing, and what was my drive. And I realized that I used to want to create like really creative images, to create images with story, and somehow like this, but somehow I have been doing things like this. And I was compelled to like make stories or make images with stories. So I would rather want to do stuff like this, but I ended up doing boring shit like this. Yes, so instead of living the dream, I ended up with a nightmare where creativity was downsizing and the song in my heart, or my drive, had stopped because my art no longer had purpose or other purpose than to generate money. So I began looking back to the beginning, and I found my creativity had always been rooted in fairy tales, or eventyr, or adventures, as we say in Norway. Making stories come alive by images. I had been trying to recreate that feeling of awe what I had as a child who believed in fairy tales. And I realized that my drive was never about money. I would happily eat Norwegian knekkebrød for a month if it meant that I could do my art and just be happy. And I remember one time as a student in London, I bought my very first Mac. And I was so skint, and I couldn't afford bus fare to go to school for 2 weeks. So I stayed in my room, and I taught myself how to do Photoshop. And I'm going to show you the image, which is really horrible. But this is my first attempt in Photoshop. And you see it's very rooted in the fairy tales. There was actually like a Norwegian black metal band that wanted this for their album. Anyways, also like one of the drives was to make like funny cartoons that I would give away to my family or friends just to make them laugh. So, and of course fear as a drive. And I was always fearless and adventurous as a child. But then, of course, later I would strive to conquer that fear, and that would inevitably come as you grow up and gain some sense. And I remember I nearly drowned as a kid, and because of that fear of water, it was probably why I started working on a ship and got a diving license later on. So I realized that these are really powerful forces. I believe you are born in a certain way, that you're wired a certain way, and that for all of my life I'd been driven by the urge to create images and stories that would come to life and make you feel like you're part of the fairy tale. I've been trying to recreate that feeling of wonder I had as a child. And I think a major threshold is passed when you're mature enough to acknowledge what drives you and so you can take the wheel and actually steer it. So I actually woke up my sleeping Fulga. And it was all because of this little bean. So she gave me, she made me realize that my work needed meaning and love to make the song sing again. So Linda was diagnosed with CP and learning disabilities. And the doctor would tell us that we shouldn't expect anything, and that there was no way of knowing what the damaged areas would do to her brain. I remember they said that if it had happened to a grown person, she would have been like in a vegetated state. But because she's a newborn baby, the brain would actually make connections around the damaged areas. And I became so fascinated with the brain and how the brain functions, so I started diving into like neuroscience and biopsychology to try and figure out the mind really works and figure out a way to actually explain this to a child. So, out of this fascination grew a fairy tale about cognitive thought that would travel through the brain and all the lobes and the brain and visit all the brain senses to try and figure out how the brain works. It would be an allegory on neuroscience for kids, where I would incorporate the brain's anatomy into landscape or into another universe. So I made a map of the brain and its functions, and then transformed them into the anatomy, into kingdoms and cities. And the cells would become, or cells and hormones would become, or given identities as characters according to their tasks and functions in the brain. So I turned back to my roots and style of storytelling that I've been most captivated when I grew up. And the dark and scary eventyr and Norse sagas that acted as sort of life lessons. They would always be a moral or ending to the stories in the old Norwegian fairy tales. So I figured they're like a medium of knowledge transfer. So I decided to fuse the world of neuroscience with Norse mythology and make it into a fantasy world. Now, mainstream publications about the Norse myths leaves us with the impression that the Norse myths are simple and straightforward stories, that they're meant to entertain children and explain natural phenomena that people were too ignorant to understand. But there's so much more to them than that, and it's the reason why I think it's so fascinating. And it's if you read them how they were supposed to be read. The myths were told in a poetic style and were elusive and metaphorical, like parables or like riddles that had to be solved or deciphered. That is how the Old Norse experienced them, as intellectual challenges that need to be solved. Now, yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I perceive it. The key to good storytelling, and that is the hidden or the esoteric, the mystery of the unknown, and a story that has many layers to be deciphered and reveal a truth. And I think it's the key for holding people's attention. It's the well-organized absence of information that drives the audience in, and it's simply because we're born problem solvers. We are compelled to deduce, because that's what we do in real life. So, a good story needs tension, a problem to be solved, and a meaning that is served to the audience in a new and interesting way. The audience needs to be captivated and made to care enough to find out how the story ends. They need to be emotionally invested in the story. And the biggest emotional investment of all is basically falling in love. The release of neurotransmitters and hormones in your brain that makes you feel empathy. So in my story, with a backdrop of brain functions and anatomy, I decided to make the next layer about human psyche, to make the audience experience the travel through the mind and into the subconscious, looking for the hidden truth. And the realization that your consciousness has the ability to create your own reality. They say that write what you know, so I figured I would draw from my own life experience and existential thoughts. But of course, it's never a story about the storyteller, it's always about the audience or the one experiencing it. So the basis became a story that everyone can relate to, and so the internal conflict between love and fear. So I had this story, but I didn't have the platform. I couldn't figure out where I would put it, if it was a game or a book or a film. But then in 2014, I believe, my flatmate in London brought me to an App World convention, and that's when I first tried on the VR headset. And it was like a revelation. It was like someone showed me the Holy Grail. I put on the goggles, and I was transported to a very pixel-rated beach and poorly executed palm trees and elevator music. And it got me really, really excited and left me with a sense of wonder again. So I thought, it was like, how incredibly awesome would it be to tell a story about the brain that teaches you about the brain while being inside the brain? And it's the idea that it could be the new medium for storytelling, and that the technology could meet creativity in the middle. It would leave us, like, the possibilities would be endless. So, the essence of storytelling will never change. It is the need for people to gather and exchange their stories and talk about the things that feel universal. It's the reason we feel the compelling need to watch stories, to tell stories and share stories. Gathering around the campfire and making ourselves feel like we're part of the whole and that we're not alone in the universe. And I find that there's like a sense of intimacy that is present in the medium of virtual reality. We're not able to put the audience into the story and make them part of the story. And this creates this sense of presence and can lead to suspension of disbelief, I believe. So that you forget the story, this is not real. Simply because you're immersed inside the story, and your mind actually experiences it as it's real. And this is the reason why I personally am drawn to VR storytelling as a platform. So I'm trying to tell a story in virtual reality. You have to challenge traditional storytelling and figure out how it works and what not works. And since the audience is free to decide where to look, I think the storyteller has to really inspire the audience where they want it to look. And this, I think, can be achieved in spatial sound and lights and making the audience emotionally invested in the characters. Because of this feeling of presence, You can make the audience feel emotionally connected to a character by positioning the character like up close, and because that in personal space is sorry. Oh yeah, sorry. So it's because of this personal space is reserved for people that you actually know and care about. Your brain will perceive this as physical closeness. So, to tell a good story, to make the audience care emotionally, intellectually, and aesthetically, you really have to make them care. And as a new medium of storytelling has the ability to inject your consciousness into another universe, into another form of existence. And I believe that when this advanced technology meets creativity, it can become indistinguishable from magic. So I am the little kid on a mission to conquer the world again. And that's why I formed Norn Studio. Norn Studio is a content company that focuses on immersive storytelling that's geared towards the entertainment and educational market. Through the process of narrative creation with storytelling and technologists, we are exploring the opportunities for content neurontology provided by the development of VR technology. Norn Studio's first project then is The Little Gray That Matters, is an episodic VR animation and a real-time interactive experience comprised by 10 20-minute episodes, where the story and visuals are designed to introduce the audience to basic neuroscience and biopsychology. And an optional game component to be added to each episode as an educational tool. The story, Gullveig, or The Little Gray That Matters, offers a story about the inner conflict between love and fear that's playing out inside our brains. Sorry. And it's an allegorical fairy tale where anatomy is mixed with Norse mythology, and the characters are personified cells, hormones, and cognitive thoughts. It's the story of Gullveig, a cognitive thought and dream designer at the Department of Fantasy, located in the prefrontal cortex. The mind is in the middle of a civil war when she is summoned by the king of neocortex to the pineal gland, or third eye. So on top of the reality generator, the assembly of Odin's wise neurons informs her of the instructional and destructive plans of the Queen of Fear, which is to destroy dreaming with her army of stress hormones and take control of the will in order to become the supreme leader of consciousness. So they reveal to Gullveig that she is the last of the Norns and Weavers of Fate, and that she's instilled with the map to the hidden mind tools that can restore fantasy. She then embarks on an epic journey with a dangerous quest, which is to sail the brainwaves through brain and mind, to save the will from enslavement in the reptile brain. And I'm just going to show you a trailer that I made. Tiny, tiny trailer. Can you? So the little girl ventures into the world looking for magic, for the magic of dreaming, and I still am. So the brain story is my attempt to capture the magic in a bottle. So this is my version of how dream forms and how the magic transcends and enlightens the mind. The realization of that your consciousness has the ability to create your own reality, all in the power of a single thought. So, like again, a good story, I have no idea how the VR or how my project ends, but I'm following the song of my heart and venturing into the unknown in the hopes that people will come and sit by my fire and hear my story. And my name is Lina Reinsbakken, and I still believe in fairy tales. Thank you.
So just so you know, this was the only trailer that was shown today that had applause coming up.
Really? That's cool.
Thank you very much for sharing this. This was a really wonderful talk. I really like your art. And do you guys have any questions? So, yeah, there you go.
How far along is the project right now?
So we have the trailer, and I made a little 5-minute demo in Unreal Engine for Oculus. It was unfunded, so it's like put together, but it's made me come a little far at least. But yeah, we need funding to like make a real trailer, or like not trailer, but the demo of a pilot episode. Yeah.
Follow-up is you can learn neuroscience by reading textbooks and going to long dreary lecture classes. Or you can go through this.
Yes.
Thought about how to measure the effectiveness of the concepts it's teaching.
I talked to a university in London, and he's the professor there who teaches neuroscience and biopsychology said it would be like he was really excited about it, and said it would be a really cool thing to like introduce the class when they started. But mainly it's for younger children from like 12 and up. It's like no, exactly. Yeah.
But maybe we can prime them with a little story that they can then take to the boring lecture, making the lecture a little less boring. All right, Lina, thank you very, very much for this nice talk. And you'll be around, so if you guys have any more questions, I think just chat afterwards. Thank you very much.